Hello there, everybody. This is Dave Kennedy coming to you from the North Pole at KringleCon 2018. I wanted to say special thanks to everybody that is here at the conference. What an amazing event that Santa has planned for us this year. And I'd like to say what we're going to be talking about today is the 5 ways the cybersecurity Grinch stole Christmas. Mostly how attackers are going after your infrastructure and how attackers are ripping through our security systems and what you can do to protect yourselves. So a special thanks to Ed Scotus and everybody else that puts this on, all the folks over there at KringleCon, making an amazing event. I'm so humbled to be here in the North Pole. It's definitely a little bit colder than I thought it would be here, but definitely happy to be here with Santa Claus and the elves, getting everything ready for Christmas. So just a brief introduction myself. My name is Dave Kennedy. I'm the founder and CEO of TrustedSec and founder of Binary Defense Systems. We're located in Cleveland, Ohio, but have folks all over the place. I've been on the news quite frequently on CNBC, Fox News, CNN, talking about a lot of different breaches that have been occurring in the media. And as of right now, with a lot of the breaches that we're seeing around the holiday timeframes, this is a perfect conversation to have about what's happening out there, the demographics of attackers, and what folks are doing to protect themselves around these chilly times of the season. I'm also the author of the Social Engineer Toolkit, co-author of Metasploit, the Penetration Tester's Guide, and I've also authored a number of open source tools like Artillery, Unicorn, the Pen Testers Framework. But in general, my whole MO is trying to give as much back to the community as possible, and really humbled at the community that we have around information security. And it's just like events like these, like KringleCon, that just make it such a unique industry in what we're trying to do to make the world a better place. And so my whole motto is really trying to give back to the community and everything that we can do out there today. So welcome everybody to KringleCon. The North Pole is actually a very interesting place. Santa has to deal with a lot of different attacks and exposures as Christmas comes along. He's in the news often. His elves are continuously working away. He's got process logic controllers and SCADA devices helping build the toys and the four-wheelers and everything that our kids are looking forward to this year. And most importantly, with any of those devices and anything that's happening out there, security is definitely paramount. And definitely something that you want to take into consideration as we're going through and looking at a lot of the different areas that are out there. And so I want to say a special thanks to Santa Claus for having me out here. I was talking to him on the phone the other day, and he's like, "Hey, can you just shoot by the North Pole real quick? I'll send my sleigh out, and we'll get you to the North Pole and have a conversation to our elves, Santa, and all of our friends out there today to talk about what's happening and how Santa can protect himself from a lot of the things that are happening out there in the wild." And so happy to be out here, Santa. Thanks for having me, and hope all the contestants have a good time. So this topic really talks about, from a security standpoint, what we're seeing out there. And I like to balance my talks, both high level and technical. There's a variety of different folks out here that are attending that have a wide aptitude of different skill sets. And so I try to kind of tailor it to everybody out there. So if you're just brand new to information security, or you're somebody that's well established in the industry, I hope you have something that you learn from this talk and something that you can learn. But most importantly, these are the top 5 things that we see out there today, both from a personal perspective, as well as what we see from businesses and corporations around how they're getting attacked, methods that attackers use to gain access to your environment, and really kind of where things are trending. I don't like doing the, hey, what's my predictions for the next year or next 5 years? But these are things that we are commonly seeing as upward trends that continuously happen year after year. And ways that corporations and companies really have a difficult time protecting themselves with things that are happening. And so let's talk about the 5 main areas around how the Grinch could steal Christmas. And around the holiday timeframes, these are some of the most toughest times when it comes to attacks. There's so much money being spent out there today that it really becomes a really rich environment for attackers to go after everything from scammers and going after different Christmas schemes. One of the ones that we saw recently is it was holiday themed, where hackers are saying that we've been visiting bad sites, and they used previously compromised breach data to send your password in the actual email from the breach site, saying, we're going to notify your family around the holiday time frames unless you pay these specific areas of Bitcoin. So hackers use this time to take advantage of what's actually occurring out there. And this isn't necessarily just around the holiday time frames. We just see a massive upward tick around scammers and around different campaigns trying to steal information, going after retailers. This time of the year tends to be some of the most trickiest ones that we see out there today. And so the number one most prominent way is social engineering, and we'll definitely talk about each one of these. Scams and ransomware perimeter flaws or areas that you have on your internet presence that might be problematic around those. Weak passwords still to this day tend to be a major problem that we see out there. And obviously data breaches. Whenever a data breach occurs, the information that is taken from those organizations can be used against you in multiple different ways. And most importantly, at the very end, we'll talk about the best ways to defend yourself and your businesses when it comes to the different types of attacks. And hopefully everybody is having a great time with family and friends around these holiday timeframes. I know for me, it's one of the best times of the year for me. I get to snuggle up with some hot chocolate and kids and family and see different people and eat way too much food. So hopefully you're doing the same as you're going through and helping Santa protect against the hackers out there. So if you look at going after an organization, and I'd like to talk a little bit about how breaches occur. There's a number of methods that attackers go after, i.e. social engineering, perimeter flaws, weak passwords, patch management, things like that. But most importantly, there's a number of different motives that attackers have when going after an organization. Most frequently we see code deployments. Is there a way for us to drop something onto the system to get code execution and the ability to establish a command and control infrastructure that allows us to attack an organization and then from there move to different systems and gain access to other systems and information. And the methods that they typically use, still to this day, primarily around 82% tends to be executables or binaries. And what that means is taking an executable or a piece of malware and dropping it onto the system and having it communicate back. And that's usually where most companies focus a lot of their efforts on when it comes to protecting themselves and trying to protect themselves from various different pieces of malware that are getting dropped. If you look at some of the trends, about 14% it has moved more towards PowerShell. And PowerShell is a full-fledged programming language in the Windows operating system that allows you to write your own code and do different things. And so about 14% of all compromises that we're seeing now has some component of PowerShell exploitation in it, which means that they're trying to gain code execution or to execute code on your system with the intent of compromising it with PowerShell itself. And it could be PowerShell goes and downloads additional code onto the system or additional files, or it executes directly into memory, which makes it a lot more difficult. Now, if you look at the statistics there, that makes up about 96% of the overall attack surface that we see out there today, primarily on Windows. If you look at what are called LOLBAS or living off the land binaries and scripts, these are new fronts of attack that we're seeing out there very heavily today. And the research is going into this area, and there's a lot of great folks in the security industry doing research on these areas, but we've seen them used and weaponized by nation states, by organized crime, by ransomware campaigns. And really where a lot of this goes into is that when Windows ships out its operating system, it has a number of binaries or executables that it comes along with it. And so there's a list of them right now. I think there's a total of like 72 or so that have been discovered, both scripts and executables that have the ability to have additional functionality in it for code execution. And the way that this works is that it's a code signing executable built into the Windows operating system, and it may have some additional functionality like, hey, I can go out to the internet, download a file, execute it into memory without any type of logging whatsoever. And these are things that usually go undetected and fly underneath the radar, and where a lot of the research around detection is coming into play right now, because most of these applications are built in .NET and don't have a lot of logging functionality around them. So when they execute, they go and download from the internet, they have the ability to execute memory. And these are where most corporations aren't focusing a lot of their efforts on, and rightfully so. It's only making up about 4% of the total attack surface that we see out there, but it's definitely an area that we should be looking at and trying to get our hands around, because it is going to be the next front of attack. And so most companies are really focusing on executables and potentially PowerShell with PowerShell version 5 and version 6 and a lot of integration into the operating system, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. There's a lot of benefits of PowerShell and being able to get PowerShell visibility in your environment to detect malicious activity, whereas these binaries and scripts that are code signed by Microsoft that get you around a lot of your application control functionality that circumvent those are a big deal. And if you look at some of the other methods or reasons for attacks, we have credential theft, information disclosure, and data access. We're seeing a massive increase in just what we call business wire fraud transfers, where an attacker will call up the CFO or send an email to the CFO or a controller within the organization and request on behalf of a merger and acquisition, or they'll compromise a third-party organization that is a trusted vendor or trusted third party, requesting invoices be sent to wire transfers and invoices be sent to a different location, and then from there hijacking that and funneling money out of the company. We just had one recently for $3 million that got through, And so business wire frauds are another one out there for huge cause for concern. And so if you look at all of those different areas, we have a lot of risk and a lot of areas that attackers are going after us. And the demographics of attackers and their sophistication really changes based on where you are in the industry, what you do, the type of intellectual property you have, or the customers that you have. For example, if you're in the industrial control system side, where you're dealing with energy or water treatment facilities or things that are a backbone to our infrastructure, you're definitely subjected to attacks when it comes to nation states. Or looking at if you do some sort of military contracting, medical research, a lot of those become big on the intellectual property theft and your access to those individual organizations. Whereas a lot of companies really fit the bill more so on organized crime, and their sophistication level varies based on the industry verticals that you're in as well. So demographics play a very important role around what you should be looking at, how you build your threat models, and really the defenses that you have in your organization to try to combat a lot of these different attacks. And so if you look at some examples of code execution, there's a free tool that I wrote called Unicorn, and this uses PowerShell. And I have to give a shout out to Matthew Graber, because this technique that I use inside of Unicorn was originally discovered by Matthew Graber. And what it does is it allows you to take PowerShell and allocate a certain portion of memory and execute shell code directly into memory without ever touching disk. So that means you don't have to go and download an additional file. You don't have to go and download additional code. You can get all of your code from essentially a one-liner PowerShell to execute on the operating system itself and then gain full access to it. Now, what's interesting is that Microsoft came out with what's called the anti-malware scan interface, or the AMSI. AMSI is in Windows 10 and above, and what it does is it has it's integrated into pretty much all of Microsoft's main product lines. They just recently came out with a lot of scripting languages, Office product lines, things like that. And what it does is there's what's essentially an AMSI provider and an AMSI subscription. An AMSI provider would be something like Windows Defender, other antivirus products that are out there. There's only a handful that currently support AMSI integration for their product lines themselves. And what happens is that whoever your AMSI provider is, let's just say it's Windows Defender, what you can do is, let's just say you're about to execute a PowerShell command and it's heavily encoded. And if you look at this next slide here, the very top one is what is being executed on the computer. So this is running PowerShell. It's a lot of endpoint detection response tools use like we'll look for like -W1, -C, but a lot of times don't look for /W or /C for window 1, hide the window, /C execute a command. And a lot of EDRs will also look for encoded command, which is a way of taking base64 encoded code and executing it on the operating system purely in memory. Now on the top here, we use what's basically value to string, which allows us to say, okay, reassemble encoded command down the road and circumvent EDRs and execute our base64 encoded strings without having to worry about detection. Now with the anti-malware scan interface, which is interesting, is it has two functions that you can call. You have AMSI scan buffer and you have AMSI scan string. Now AMSI scan buffer will take an allocated portion of memory and scan that buffer space for malicious activity. AMSI scan string will allow you to submit a string value to the AMSI engine and then submit that to the AMSI provider, which ends up being, in this case, in our example, Windows Defender. And so what will happen is the very top part, if you ran that through an antivirus engine, nothing would pop up. There would not be any type of detection whatsoever on that because it's using encoded command obfuscation techniques and it's trying to obfuscate the code itself. But what ends up happening belowhand and what is seen in the actual PowerShell interpreter prior to actually executing and what's actually being executed on the underlying operating system itself, right before actual execution, this is what gets presented to the AMSI provider, i.e. Windows Defender. And so if you look below, you can see here, this is essentially our raw code right before it's about to be executed. And so what's interesting about that is that we have a much better detection criteria with AMSI than we would above. However, the problem is that all of these antivirus products are still very much signature driven. So for example, with Windows Defender specifically, they'll write signature updates for Unicorn quite frequently, and it's literally about 3 minutes for me to write a bypass technique to get around their signatures. The signatures are still very, very rudimentary, very basic. And to put it in perspective, you can do substitutions, for example, which will replace the zeros with an @ sign, and then as a part of execution, it'll go and actually run those. And so you can create variations more polymorphic ways of getting around this that aren't super complex or tough. You can even just XOR all this data, and it will get completely around their detection criteria. And so while AMSI is very powerful, the technology behind it, those providers, are extremely basic in nature. In addition, if you just take substitutions or you use XORing instead of base64 encoding, it won't even recognize it as base64 encoded strings and completely circumvent AMSI in the first place. There's also ways, there's a number of techniques out there today. I know the fine folks over at CyberArk published a paper where you can manually patch offsets with inside AMSI.dll that allow you to essentially turn AMSI off so it doesn't even scan it in the first place. So while there's a lot of great stuff in PowerShell and built into Windows 10 and above, to get around them is literally trivial for us as attackers if we know what we're doing. And it's really not a substantial way to protect against your infrastructure. You need to look more at the indicators, not necessarily relying off of a specific tool. And what I mean by that is it literally takes us as attackers, if we know what we're doing, 2 to 3 minutes to circumvent Windows Defender, to get around whatever that AMSI provider is and allow us to execute code unfiltered on the operating system itself. And so PowerShell is a good example here for code execution. So let's talk about the first method for attack, and that's really social engineering. This is one of my favorite ones to go and do. Social engineering is really just about creating a fantasy. Would you believe something that I'm about to send to you? And if you would, what is my objectives as an attacker? So a lot of times I'll target 1 or 2 people within the organization with very specific pretext, or around the holiday timeframes. I love giving gift cards. It's funny about gift cards is that if you give them like 15 or 20 bucks, your percentage actually goes down than if you're giving them $5 because of the believability factor. So my recommendation is if you're going to fish somebody with a gift card, obviously with permission and doing it as part of your job, then use a lower amount of quantity for $5. And a lot of times what we'll do is we'll actually use legitimate like Starbucks gift cards or things like that they can use at the store so that we don't trigger any alarms or trip up anybody. So we'll buy $100 worth of gift cards, we'll target 50 people or 20 people, and we'll use that as our main method, or target only 1 or 2 people. And usually what it is they have to log into their system, so we steal their username and password, and then we try some form of code execution to gain access to them. And social engineering really ends up being still our primary method for attack, and what we see out there for post-compromise analysis, where we see most folks falling for something, and then from there using that as their main way to get into the environments. Looking at scams and ransomware, around this time of the year, we've seen a 317% increase just from a binary defense perspective. And this goes for phishing campaigns, online fraud, coupon fraud, you name it. We're seeing a huge increase right now around the holiday timeframes just because around that amount of spend that is happening in general. And talking real quick about the business wire frauds, if you ever are subjected to those where your organization falls prey to that type of scam where someone actually wires money, work with your local FBI office, and within 72 hours, if you can notify them, they can usually recall that information almost immediately, or recall that money almost immediately within a 72-hour window. But you do only have a 72-hour window. After that, it becomes very challenging to get that money back. So first and foremost, if you ever get hit with a business wire fraud, notify the FBI and come back from that side. What we're also seeing is selling credentials online to make a profit. And what's really interesting about organized crime specifically, and this is a trend that has been ticking upward, and these specific organized crime groups have been maximizing their monetary gain for compromising companies. And what I mean by that is that they'll start off with something like a business wire fraud where they compromise an email address, but then they'll use that for post-compromise, and then they'll use ransomware deployment as a secondary method so they can maximize business wire fraud transfers. Once they get the money from that, hit them with ransomware, from there make as much money as possible, and after that, sell the credentials online. And so making multiple revenue streams from one compromise is a new trend that we're seeing just happening this year for a lot of organized crime groups that are really trying to get as much money as they possibly can from a compromise itself, going and getting access to data, encrypting it, getting access to data and selling it on the underground market, or holding the company ransom for that type of information. Those are all things that we continuously see out there. And just recently, this was in July, McAfee did a study on some dark web analysis and showing that one of the big things is compromising weak RDP credentials. And a lot of times what will happen there is they'll compromise a company, they'll do the business wire fraud transfers, they'll do all the other ones, but they'll use like the online Bitcoin mining ones where they're just mining for Bitcoins and things like that from compromise, and they'll sell those once they're done with those to other individuals online. And you can have complete access to a vulnerable system on the internet for as little as $3 a piece. And so this is something that we see definitely as an upward trend of misconfigurations. And obviously if you're exposing a remote desktop from the outside, we have other challenges and problems to talk about, but just some of the things that we're seeing out there too. On perimeter flaws, if you look at just patch management in general, Perimeter flaws end up being some of the easiest ways that we can get into aside from social engineering. If we look at like the Equifax breach or a number of the other ones out there, it was typically due to a missing patch, weak credentials, or ways of being able to even enumerate user accounts. A lot of times the ways that we'll get into a company is we'll either use previously breached data, which we'll talk about here in just a second, or we'll find some sort of metadata on the website, on one of the websites that enumerates their user ID scheme. So usually it's like first dot last, or some sort of incremental number that we can guess and find a pattern in. And then from there, we'll go to LinkedIn, scrape the sites for those looking for different usernames associated with weak passwords. And then from there, run brute force accounts. And all we need to find is a response code that gives us a success and a fail. And so if we can use OWA, or if we can use a VPN concentrator or different other methods, those are all key things that we can use as attackers to identify weak credentials and passwords. And so a lot of companies have invested into two-factor authentication. And what's interesting with two-factor authentication is that there are good ways to do two-factor authentication, there are bad ways to do two-factor authentication. And a lot of it comes down to would a user actually error, or would a user actually do something on behalf of the company that can be social engineered around? And so that's where you look at it, like where RSA was originally with the hardware tokens, which was a great practice. You actually had to have access to a hardware token. You had to enter in your information into the site for your one-time PIN, and that PIN, rotated as well. Same thing for like Google Authenticator or Duo Security, have the same type of functionality where you have it now installed on your phone, and now you have the ability to go back and enter in that information back and forth in those different areas there. And so I think with those are all solid solutions. You're entering in a randomized code into your environment. SMS is okay, but there's definitely a lot of ways that especially now you're seeing a lot of attacks starting to happen on the SMS side. I think the risks that you have from that's still relatively low, but the potential for something occurring via SMS messages, one-time PINs, is definitely there. And so typically we'll see three variations of two-factor authentication: PIN, phone, and push. And so just to give you a recent pen test that we did, we were able to find 5 user accounts that had weak passwords. And usually you could take like the company name paired with the year and maybe throw an exclamation point in there, and you slowly brute force all the user accounts over time, and only doing like 1 or 2 at a time, waiting maybe an hour for the lockout threshold to be reset, and not actually locking out accounts, but the timer for how many invalid attempts were used. When you start to go through and try different user accounts with weak passwords, a lot of times we can find quite a few users that have the local sports team 2018, summer 2018, winter 2018, password 1, you name it, company name 2018, and different iterations of those. And you can spend, and we've written tools that basically you send it towards one of these devices, and it just sits there and does all those variations over time, all automated, and just goes over a span of a few weeks or months, enumerating as many user accounts as we possibly can. And so once we get these user accounts, a lot of times you have two-factor authentication, especially across your VPN concentrators, especially across your OWA instances, or whether you're leveraging Office 365. And on this recent pen test, we had 5 user accounts. And so what we did is we tried logging into 5 of those user accounts, and on the very 5th, so you could tell based on the responses that we were getting back from the site itself, we were having a delay. And that delay was basically sending a push notification to each one of those 5 users. And so the first one hit deny, we got an unauthorized access. Second one hit deny. Third one hit deny. Fourth one hit deny. Fifth one hit approve. And when you look at push notifications, think about it. You have, let's just say 10,000 users. You give them the ability to say, hey, am I logging in from somewhere or not, or am I not? And even we obviously made the location look like it was coming from that location around where the headquarters of that company was, to at least try to remove some suspectability around the geolocation of where it's occurring from. And so what are you going to do in that situation when you're a user? Well, hey, I'm probably logging in from somewhere, so they hit approve, which allowed us access into the VPN, and then from there to try to attack the organization in a number of different ways. We find this pretty much on every single penetration test that we do, where if you're leveraging something like push notifications, it's really detrimental to the security itself, because users have the ability to error. It's not like a PIN number you're entering into the site to be able to do it. And obviously this is a decision for ease of use and something that you want your users to be able to do. Security shouldn't be a major hindrance in your organization and everything else. But at the same time, this specific type of technology is something where there's a high level of error, a prone level of error to do something like that. Weak passwords still to this day. Passwords should go away in every way, shape, or form, but this makes our lives easier as attackers when we find weak passwords. And a lot of these will meet your password requirement complexities. Like if you have Microsoft's password complexity enabled, you need was it 2 or 3 out of the 4. So capitalization and numbers can substitute, and lowercase and alphanumeric can substitute for that. You don't even need exclamation point or a special character. So a lot of these are ways for us to be able to identify metadata out there, use that information then to attack an organization and get access into an environment. All things that are definitely possible with us as attackers, and as we go through the perimeter of your organization to find that information out there and use that against you to get access to it. We love breach data, things like the LinkedIn data breach, for example, doing password analysis around that. So what you can do is take an analysis around, let's just say LinkedIn, for example, compare that to the company name that we're going after, and then look for patterns of passwords in there. Like, for example, did they use summer 2015 or Snuggles 2015, and then just simply changing that to Snuggles 2018, would that work? Most humans definitely have some sort of pattern that we can use. Or if there's some sort of pattern in the environment where they somehow put in LinkedIn to the actual password itself, and so you change the LinkedIn to whatever service that you're trying to get access to. Those are all things that people will typically err on, and where passwords really still to this day become major weak points for us in organizations. And so let's talk about some steps to success. Social engineering really comes down to education and awareness, and really having the ability to have people that have a good understanding around what's possible out there. You're not trying to make security experts of everybody. That's not possible. But what is possible is giving them some information that if they see something unusual or weird, they have the ability to report that and know where to go to report that. And it's not going to mean that everything that you do is going to be perfect. It just means that users have a mechanism to report that. They're aware of the situations that are around there, and you're trying to change their patterns of behavior. And that's why we see continual education and awareness. Phishing campaigns that go to websites that have better education around that, instead of just trying to own somebody, and helping work people through different issues around what's fake and what's not, definitely has a major impact around companies. I mean, companies that we do penetration tests for, and we do social engineering and phishing campaigns against them, companies that have education awareness, we definitely see a percentage drop, but most importantly, out of that percentage drop, we see healthy communication around detecting those breaches as they're occurring. Even if we're going after 1 or 2 or 3 people, have a much higher probability of people reporting that as being potentially suspicious than anything else. Second, network segmentation is huge. Companies still don't focus on this, and I don't understand why. I understand it's a big undertaking, but even doing simple things like putting your Windows firewall on in your environment so that workstation to workstation communication can't happen. Put your firewalls, your built-in Windows firewalls that you use on an everyday basis or that you have disabled, put that on. Don't allow workstation to workstation communication. If you have to do some remote maintenance, there are group policy settings that you can put in place to allow exceptions to certain subnet ranges that maybe you have your IT help desk, your folks working on that can still remote into those devices, but still block workstation or workstation communication. One of the biggest risks that we face today is lateral movements, the ability to compromise one system, use information off of one system to get access to multiple other systems out there today. And really today, that's the main method that attackers are using. If you segment your network appropriately, where workstations and servers are limited on ports and protocols, and you don't allow workstation or workstation communication, it starts to become very challenging for an attacker to break out of that and use it. And hopefully those alarms are becoming much louder from a detection standpoint, that you can actually do that versus 4 years ago or 6 months ago, or versus a year that a breach has been in your environment, to be able to really respond to those much quicker than having an attacker have full access to your environment and all your intellectual property within a few minutes or a few days. And so along with that comes being more proactive on detection. If you've heard the term threat hunting is basically using forensics, but more proactively. If you look at traditional security operations centers, what would happen with security operations centers is you'd wait for an alarm to come up. And once the alarm came up, you'd see whether or not it's malicious, and a large percentage of those typically are false positives. And then from there, you'd respond to those alarms. With threat hunting, you're becoming much more proactive in looking for weird patterns of behavior. You're going out looking at all command line auditing that's being used. Like a good example, if I compromise an organization, I gain access to their environment. The first thing I typically do is I drop down to a command prompt, suspicious thing there, and I usually try to identify who's part of specific groups and users. Like for example, using like the net groups command to look at the domain and what users have access to domain administrator groups, or what access have to web applications or SQL services. Looking for those commands can be a great indication in your environment that something's amiss, because that is not a common thing that Bob and sales would typically do. I can't imagine Bob and sales dropping down to a command shell, executing net group commands and looking for specific things. And so going through and being more proactive, looking at your PowerShell commands. Sysmon, which is a free tool from Microsoft, is a fantastic resource to getting more visibility into your environment. Looking at DNS traffic, looking for time intervals for beacons around command and control infrastructure, looking for dynamic DNS instances. Those are all things that can be possible. Lateral movement's another great example. Event log ID 4624, originating from a workstation IP address or host name with a login type of 3. That means that somebody's remotely logging in from a workstation or workstation communication standpoint on the network using some sort of account. And you can look at that account and say, okay, well, I only want to look at administrators or things like that. And you can usually see workstation or workstation communication that way and general lateral movement in your environment. Again, all things that we can do very quickly from a detection standpoint that give us a high probability of detection by going more proactive. And that's really where, as an industry, we have to really shift towards. We can't just use a checklist of common attack cycles, run that through as an automation tool, and then see what detections we have. We actually have to simulate those, use them through, and try to detect those as we're going along and being more proactive around very specific edge cases. I'm a huge fan of the MITRE ATT&CK framework. I think it's a fantastic resource to do simulations, but people are basically using it as a checklist to see whether or not they have detection, and getting around those becomes extremely trivial. I've gone into so many companies leveraging MITRE as their base framework, and they don't have any detection criteria for anything that we're doing because we've manipulated or changed it in just a little tiny way that's out there. And so leveraging MITRE more so for a understanding around different attack avenues and simulating that and looking more at the behavior of what's occurring is much more desirable. And then that last bullet point there, do regular users actually need PowerShell in the first place? I'm not talking about your web developers that might need access to it or your administrators, but do regular users actually need access to PowerShell? Step 2, patch management. Still to this day, patching is one of the most highest probability of likelihoods that we're seeing out there. A lot of times we see like a patch that's 6 months or older from a CVE perspective that attackers use to exploit and gain access to the systems. And so just doing basic patch management, removing known attack methods that attackers use on a regular basis or known exploits that are out there in the wild are ways that we can use that out there. And if you're not in a position yet in your company to have good patch management, you absolutely have to have detection in place as a mitigating control to really fix a lot of those issues around detection criteria that you have. So patch. I know everybody says it and everybody's tired of hearing it, and it's a super pain. You have to get better at patch management just as an industry alone to get better with the code that we're seeing out there today. And step 3, continual testing, really, really important. Your goal, with most organizations is really focusing on penetration testing. And what happens out of penetration testing is you take those results, you try to build those fixes in, both technical and strategic, to say, okay, well, in the future, we're gonna try to get better at this, and eventually getting more towards red teaming, which is more simulations against your organization, building around threat models, and trying to simulate those capabilities of an attacker to see how well you do in each of the stages. And that leads directly into what we call purple teaming, which is red and blue working together, more of that collaboration front to work as one another to help each other. And I think from a purple teaming perspective, it's really important to understand that our goal in security is not to own everything and destroy everything and to make us look good as a red teaming perspective. It's to make the organization to get better, for us to get better as a red team, and for them to get better on the defense as well. And the only way that I've ever seen companies get better on this, both from a detection, prevention, and a response perspective, is going through these collaborative exercises with one another. You have to do it. I think Santa would agree that working with the elves on a regular basis and giving them education, having them understand what's occurring out there, makes the organization much better as a whole and protects Santa's environment in a very different way. Also, investing in the right people. People is most important we see out there today. Technology is not. There's products out there that's out, 99.5% prevention and 100% detection. Well, that's 99.5% prevention and 100% detection on the things that they know about, the things that they've written signatures for. If you manipulate or change those in any way, shape, or form, you completely circumvent their product. It's not the technology. And the technology might be decent, but having the people that understand the technology and to make the technology better is really what you want to focus on. And so going and buying all the latest, greatest blinking boxes and everything else that's out there today doesn't make you more secure. It's investing in the right people, having teamwork, having a collaboration and positivity within your team, being excited about what you do. All of that goes a long ways. Password management is obviously another major concern for organizations, and passwords just need to go away, period. But giving the ability for users to error, they will. And so you have user accounts frequently in your environment that have bad passwords. Don't allow them to also do something like push notification as well. Those are all things that can make it much more difficult for you in your environment. And one thing I'll leave with as well on this is that if you look at a lot of the guidelines that are coming out now from Microsoft with NIST, they state to use a much longer password for that, and having the history, the reset time frame much longer. So instead of doing, let's just say 90 days, you have a 20-character password or a 15-character password for 6 months, because cryptographically, in order to actually crack like hash values, for example, that computation space should take much larger to do than the time period that you have out there. But what's interesting about that dilemma, and I'm not a huge fan of this at all, is that most of the passwords that we see get compromised are due to phishing. So what happens is that a user enters in their credentials, which might be 15 characters or 20 characters. Now that password is compromised from a much longer time period. So having a larger time period increases your exposure and time window that password is valid in your environment. Having a less one reduces that time that's out there too. So I'm not a huge fan of longer passwords with longer expiration periods. I'm a much bigger fan of having complex passwords and having a shorter period that's out there today. An interesting story, I actually cracked a 27-character password one time, and it was using rules within Hashcat. And the person's password was repetitive. It was like meow.meow.meow.meow.meow, exclamation point, which is technically a complex password, but it's repetitive and easy to crack. So just because the password is long doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be something that we can't crack as an attacker that's out there. And that's really it. That's the main areas that you have to focus on going into 2019 and what we're seeing out there today as far as breach patterns that are out there. Most importantly, I think it's safe to say that there are ways of stopping these attacks that are out there. And as companies continuously move forward and faster in technology, in security, we have to do the same thing. We have to be able to meet the security requirements of the future by working with organizations and moving quick and having programs in place that can actually help those. And just understanding the ways that attackers are going after your infrastructure and ways that you can defend it, allow you to build that strategy out and help you build your threat modeling and the defensive capabilities you have, but most importantly, the detections out there. 9 times out of 10, the companies that we see that are working, that have a stronger security posture for us not to actually hit, are companies that are continuously going through exercises, that are building that strategy into their environment, that aren't just sitting there waiting for the new attack to come on, trying to figure out a way to get that signature built into their environment. Those are all things that I think are super important and, out there for us to be able to do. And as an industry, going into 2019, we have to continuously educate our businesses, folks that we're dealing with, our families, around things that they can do to protect themselves. Technology is going to get more and more complex, and we have a really big duty to go and help that. So I want to say, again, special thanks to KringleCon. Now get out there, go save Santa, go save Christmas, and have a wonderful set of holidays, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks to everybody at KringleCon for having me here. Thanks to Santa, the elves, the sleigh that got me here safely in the North Pole. And wish everybody a good time with their family and friends, and we'll see you in 2019. Thanks, everybody.